So in paragraph 831, Dr. Jung makes the assertion that the psyche is a phenomenon not subject to our will. It is nature, and though nature can, by skill, knowledge, and patience, be modified at a few points, it cannot be changed into something artificial without profound injury to our humanity. Here's the kicker of this paragraph. Man can be transformed into a sick animal, but not molded into an intellectual ideal. I'll read that to you one more time. Man can be transformed into a sick animal, but not molded into an intellectual ideal. So the significance of paragraph 831 is that Dr. Jung's main work comes from instinct. It doesn't come from some ideal. It doesn't come from the logos. It comes from Eros. And so it's the opposite of logos, really. And one of the things he emphasized is that you cannot know anything psychologically until you have experienced it. And so if you've been binging on Jordan Peterson and you haven't gone out to get a life yet, time to do that, because then you'll have the experience and then you'll know what Dr. Jung was talking about, and you will know the limitations of the logos, which is part of what we're going to be talking about tonight. Paragraph 832, the unconscious component really is unconscious. There are no boundaries that can be assigned. We cannot say where the psyche begins or ends. Consciousness and its contents are modifiable. Going deeper, we realize that there is something autonomous down there. So in other words, there is a conscience complex down deep in our unconscious, which is autonomous from our ego part of the mind. I don't want to confuse you by saying self. That wouldn't be right. Thomas says, what does he mean by intellectual ideal? A bit unsure. Since this is his essay on conscience, I think what he's talking about is the moral code. And if somebody is totally stuck on the logos side of the ledger, they will think that you can just make a bunch of rules and then everyone will follow them. And the problem that you get into, which we'll get into in a few minutes here, is that you have conflict of duties, and then you have to step away from the moral code and make a conscientious decision. And that often isn't exactly what you had in mind originally. So an intellectual ideal in this case would be a moral code, like the Ten Commandments, I think. Thomas says it's obvious what he means by sick animal. Yeah, that points back to my favorite quote, which I have here on my computer, and I repeat every time I have the opportunity. Too much of the animal distorts civilized man. Too much civilization makes sick animals. And we are animals, and we have to realize that. And Opiami says the intellectual idea is manifesting in artificial intelligence technology. Yes, I agree with that. And the question is there any life in that? Thomas says the accent on experience goes back to what Joseph Campbell said about the meaning of life and searching for it. I'm conflicted about Joseph Campbell because Joseph Campbell actually came after Jung. And I used to think of him in the 90s. I was thinking of Joseph Campbell as my guru. But then I heard a tape one time of a talk that Joseph Campbell was giving. And he was asked by a woman at the end of his lecture, what is the meaning of life? And he says, oh, there's no meaning of life. There's only an experience of life. I don't think that was a very good formulation. And it didn't come across well to me the first time I heard it. And as I look at it more and more, I think that Dr. Jung actually had the better idea on the meaning of life, but Joseph Campbell didn't hear that because he died before the Red Book was published, and he probably didn't know the Red Book was published. But, I mean, that's not to diminish Joseph Campbell. Joseph Campbell was a great researcher into mythology, and the book about his life, Fire in the Mind, is a very powerful book, which I once read while driving, literally while driving through North Carolina about 25 years ago. Dan says, can't be molded into intellectual ideals. Stalin's Russia and Mao's China were examples of that statement, absolutely. Thomas, is it the sick animal who feels his conscience is a guilty conscience? No, I think it's a healthy animal that feels his conscience as a guilty conscience, but we'll get into that in a couple of minutes. Andy says, is conscience a strictly human thing or an emergent property? He does make a statement a little later on that animals do have consciences. So I think it is emergent in the animal world in general, more so in humans, of course. Andy, I see altruism throughout nature. Absolutely. We definitely do. I mean, I even saw it with my collies, so it definitely exists. Biami says, Jordan Peterson has just become a carnivore. He was always a meathead anyway. Well, Jordan Peterson does a lot of good thinking, I think, but tends to overemphasize the logos. And, in fairness, I think that is a reflection of the fact that he deals with a lot of human suffering in clinical settings as a clinical psychologist. And let that be a lesson to you. Don't go running off to become a clinical psychologist unless you understand that you're going to be dealing with other people's very troubling life situations. And I don't know how anyone does it. And the fact that Jordan Peterson has done as much as he has is to his credit. And he obviously knows a lot of things, but his 12 Rules of Life seems to have emerged from that setting, and it hasn't, in my view, put enough emphasis on life experience. Or he's shied away from life experience because he knows how bad it can be. But of course, he's dealing with the outliers who are willing to come to a psychoanalyst. And he says he's making his money while he can, true to form. Yeah, fair enough. He wrote a brilliant book. He wrote one brilliant book, which is Maps of Meaning. I think very highly of the book. I'm not finished with it yet. I'm listening to it on audible.com, and I think I have about 8 of the 30 hours to go. I also listened to 12 Rules of Life. I did not like that book much at all, but I do like Maps of Meaning, and the 15 years of effort that he put into it definitely shows. The problem is it's extremely tightly packed, and so 25 years from now, there'll be somebody like me who's doing videos unpacking Maps of Meaning so others can understand what he was talking about. Thomas says, I found a fuller quote of Campbell's on the meaning of life, though he can be a bit abrasive at times. That Campbell book was a good biography. I read it also. Thomas says, people say that what we're all seeking is a meaning for life. I think that what we're seeking is an experience of being alive, so that our life experiences on the purely physical plane will have resonances with our own innermost being and reality. so that we actually feel the rapture of being alive. That was the Campbell quote. I think that that's a little, nerdy, brainy as a definition. I did a piece on the meaning of life a few months back, and you can find it. I'll put a link to it under the playback of this. But my conclusion was that what Dr. Jung was saying in the Red Book was that the meaning of life is you, that each one of us is the result of millions, billions of years of successful reproduction down to us. And the spirit has been steadily manifesting through that time, and it's manifesting through all human beings, all 7.5 billion of us. And the question is, for all religions, where is the spirit taking us? And Dr. Jung was troubled by the idea that at least Christianity and Judaism and Islam are all pointing back to events which occurred 2,000 to 3,500 years ago, and not trying to work out where we're going. So we've got all these historians who are called theologians, but we don't have any forward-looking people. I don't know if we should call them theologians or something else, but maybe we need some scientists who are going to figure out where the spirit is taking us. I think that more and more as I worked on the Mercurius book a couple weeks back and posted some of that in the last couple of days. Gray says, there are two types of consciousness as defined by Jacques Pansky. So from the biological side, so deep or midbrain. Gray says, we are hopeful to have cognitive control of the affective processes. And Dr. Pansky says that's the goal of psychotherapy. I think we're a ways from that. It would be nice if we get control of the cognitive processes, but I'm doubtful. Anyway, okay, so paragraph 833. Ordinary morality is a basic law of the unconscious, or at any rate influences it. That's the general idea. That's ordinary morality, basic law. He says, and I have it in red here, this is in flagrant contradiction to the common experience of the autonomy of the unconscious. It cannot be an integral part of the psyche's structure, but autonomous aspect often does operate in parallel with the moral code. So there's this conscience autonomous complex that may look like the moral code in many ways, but then you get conflicts of duties, and then you get this, the unconscious delights in spawning every conceivable immorality. And he gives the example of St. Paul in Romans 7:19. For the good that I would, I do not, but the evil which I would not, that I do. Okay, so Dr. Jung is talking about the opposites at work in the unconscious, and how there's a wild part of the autonomous unconscious that we don't have control of. And so paragraph 835, dreams often lead us astray. Ego has to make the final decision because there are conflicts of duty. And I just wanted to mention to all of you that my wife and I, in the last couple of days, have watched a terrific movie. It's probably R-rated, but it's on Netflix, I think, and it's called Butter, B-U-T-T-E-R, Butter. And it is hilarious. And there are lots of conflicts of duty. It's a bit raunchy, which is probably why we didn't see it in the theaters, but it is just very, very funny, and it's worth watching. We've watched it twice already. And I think it may become one of my favorite movies of all time. So the movie is called Butter, Butter. Thomas says, can the conscious mind ever control the unconscious mind? Very doubtful. Andy, there will be no control. I believe mankind is so utterly regressive intellectually, we've already come close to peak idiot. Well, we're working on it in the 21st century, I have to admit, Andy, but I do think that we have potential if we start to work our brain cells on some of this stuff. And yet we march forward, as you rightly say. Gray says, unlikely, considering the roots are thicker from the bottom up as opposed to the weak roots that go from the top down. Gray says, listen to the H-A-I-D-T talk about the elephant and the rider. And he says, my brain hurts. Gray says, always a good feeling. Yep, we're cooking along.